Some compounds promise performance. Others promise longevity. But what if one molecule could mimic the effects of exercise at the cellular level in promoting both longevity and performance, and deliver those benefits across metabolic health and mitochondrial function and athletic performance and organ recovery? So in this episode, we're going to dive into the science of SLU-PP-332. This is a cutting-edge ERRα agonist and AMPK activator that's redefining what's possible in performance optimization and cellular medicine. Joining me today to have this discussion is Anthony Castore, a true pioneer in the field of optimization and performance. He is the founder of Drive Longevity Solutions, the creator of the Castore method. With over 30 years in coaching elite athletes, executives, and clinicians, he blends a high-level training strategy with deep biochemical insight. In today's episode, we're going to explore how SLU-PP-332 works, what are the benefits, what are the things to look out for, and actually go over some real-world protocols and case studies and why this compound is especially powerful when paired with other targeted training and lifestyle strategies to improve optimization. Whether you're a physician learning to learn more about these advanced tools, chasing the next frontier of health, or just curious about the future of metabolic health, this episode delivers science-backed insights with zero fluff. Let's dive right in. Hey, man, Anthony, I want to welcome you to the show. It's an honor to have you here, and I appreciate you making time for this. So I read your bio, man, and it's pretty impressive. You've been in the performance world for over 3 decades, over 30 years, like and you've seen all the changes. You've seen the good, the bad, the ugly come and go. And you've had the opportunity to coach elite athletes, man, and executives, and even physicians as well, because we need trainers too. Sometimes we don't know what we're doing in the gym and what we're doing with supplements sometimes when it comes to that. But what led you down this path of performance optimization and cellular medicine and longevity, and getting into the compounds like we're gonna talk about today with the SLU and other things?
Yeah, so I guess the gray in my beard gives me away in terms of career length. It's kind of a funny story how I got started with training and all this stuff. Long time ago, graduated high school about $117 dripping wet, and my girlfriend at the time was 118 pounds. And we're at Purdue, the bars stay open a little later, fight breaks out across the bar, and jokingly, but probably seriously, she says, if that was a little closer over here, I might have had to jump in front. So I'm like, wow, I think I really need to start working out. So I kind of dove headfirst into the whole working out thing. I played sports in high school, but I was like, it's time to put on some size. And I was really blessed. I had an amazing strength coach. He competes in World's Strongest Man now. His name's Chad Coy. And as I'm getting into the training, within the first 6 months, went from 117 up to 185 completely naturally and dropped 2% body fat. And I was like, wow, I am hooked. I always loved science and kind of finding out how things work. So it really clicked. And I had some dreams of maybe being a bodybuilder, but you've seen me in person, I didn't pick the right parents for that. So quickly, I discovered that the science part of it was a lot more interesting to me. There's that old saying, those who can do and those who can't coach. So I'm the coach. And from day one, I was fascinated by the different nutrition compounds, all the supplementation around bodybuilding. And what started as this, I just got to put on more muscle, really became kind of a deep dive into health and how our body sends these signals and how everything works together. And it was just this natural curiosity I've always had about science that just blossomed. And from day one, it was like, I just got to find out more. And ever since then, it's always been, there's one more thing I have to learn. And my fiance will tell you it probably drives her crazy. We'll be sitting around watching Netflix, and I've got one of those brains that, I'll see something on TV, and all of a sudden, I have to know everything about it. And with regards to the cellular medicine and the peptides, that sort of stuff, I guess it was back in 96, right around the time Mike Francois won the Arnold Classic. IGF had kind of made this big splash in the bodybuilding scene, and I started reading about it. And it was funny, I remember reading it and thinking, this might actually override my bad genetics. Well, of course, we know it won't, but when I learned about IGF and the way it worked and everything, it was fascinating. And then I ended up finding out about melanotin. And the worst part about bodybuilding, other than not having the right genes to really excel, was the smell of that protein stuff that you have to put on if you're competing. And when I found out I could take a peptide and get stage filler, I'm like, what other peptides are there and how can I learn about them? So, kind of been doing some reading about this stuff as far back as the 90s. And then when A4M and SSRP and now we've got New Bioages organization and these others started putting out educational material. I consume this stuff. I joke with people that I'm an edgeaholic. So every time a course comes out, I feel like I have to do it. And it's just this beautiful continuing learning process that we're never going to have all the answers, but the more we dig in, more we can learn about this stuff, more we can help other people, and the more we can kind of figure out ourselves. So just a lot of fun to be in this space and blessed for the opportunities that I've had.
One thing when we're kind of like, reading through your bio, we were talking about this and looking at some of the discussions you've had. You've been using SLU, or the compound we're going to talk about, the SLU. I've been calling it SLU. Apparently it's SLU. SLU, tomato. But you've been using this compound since, as far back as 2022, well before most people heard about it. I just heard about it late last year, or actually last summer during the Olympics, and we're going to get into that. Can you walk us through how you found out about it?
Yeah, so it was really kind of interesting. My dad doesn't have the best health, and it's ironic because I spend 100% of my time learning about stuff to be able to help other people, but our parents never want to take advice from us. And he'd had some heart trouble, and I was researching things that could help with cardiac function, and I came across these ERRs, and in particular, there was the SLU-PP-332, and then there was a SLU-PP, I think it was 915, which I still haven't been able to source to this day. But it was when I was reading that paper and learning about the effects it can have, like on mitochondria and those sorts of things, how the wheels started turning. And it was like, wow, not only is this something that could potentially help people that have like heart problems or fatty liver, some other stuff that I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later. But, the performance side of me, the meathead in me was like, might be some opportunity for performance here. So that was kind of my first dive in there. And then in terms of access and that sort of thing, one of the cool things about being in the strength training community for so long, and it's probably the same for physicians, you just build this huge network of people, really all through the country, all through the world. And through conversations, able to track things down, and one thing led to another.
Okay. Awesome. It's kind of like the detective, right? You learn about something, you look it up. How do I get it? How do I try it? I think we've all kind of had that experience with like some of the newer compounds and newer peptides. So this is where a great transition here. So what exactly is SLU-PP-332? And not only we want to talk about what it is, but how does it work? And you mentioned the ERRs, those estrogen-related receptors. Like, how does it work, especially in relationships to that? Because that's the key driver of it from what I've read and what I understand.
Yeah, no, that's 100% correct. And one kind of cool, I always like to talk about like nomenclature with stuff, and just to start out, and it kind of demystifies that alphabet soup sitting in front of us. So when we think about a compound like SLU-PP-332 and how this all come about, so the SLU actually stands for something, St. Louis University, and it was first synthesized in the early 2000s. And then the PP that's in the middle, that's usually going to denote some type of a research group like peptide project. And then the 332 is going to be that identifier number. So when we look at these alphabet soup things, it's always kind of fun to think about, what does this actually mean? For the sake of simplicity, like I always just kind of refer to it as like SLU or SLOOP. So as we're continuing with the conversation, so people kind of follow along. When we talk about what SLU is, it's what's called an exercise mimetic. And what we mean by an exercise mimetic is quite literally like when we think about when we're exercising, and the cellular signaling that's happening inside of us, it's basically mimicking these things. And it's almost like, to use an analogy, if we put on like a virtual reality headset and it feels like we took a trip to Paris, then we take that headset off and it's like, oh man, we're still in Ohio. But it's kind of tricking our body into thinking and creating a lot of those same sensations. So an exercise mimetic's almost like virtual reality headset for your physiology. As you pointed out, it works through this activation of these nuclear receptors. And when we're talking about nuclear receptors, these are going to be these estrogen-related receptors. And the one that we're most focused on is ERRA, but I'll explain all of them here shortly. The EAA is going to indirectly activate, a lot of people are probably familiar with like the AMPK. So that's going to be the AMP activated protein kinase. And just to kind of unpack this and see where we're at right now, what that means is that these ERRAs are going to hit these nuclear receptors that are going to trigger this AMPK to say, or make our body think that we're low in energy. So that energy thermostat is reading low. And when we think about, well, what's that mean if we're running low on energy? Well, irregardless what our goals are, our cell wants to survive. So in order to restore that balance and create energy, it's going to do things like boost fat burning, glucose uptake, and so on. So essentially what it's doing is it's creating aerobic exercise without having to get out of your chair. Now, I want to stress that this doesn't mean quit exercising. There's so many benefits to exercise. And when we think about, SLU or peptide or anything, the best way to think about it is we take those signals that we're sending from things like our lifestyle, our environment, exercise, and this is like hooking up an amplifier to them. So there's going to be a more profound adaptation. So hopefully that kind of explains a little bit about like the exercise mimetic part of it. Now, when we look at the ERRs, estrogen-related receptors, first of all, I should clarify, when we talk about estrogen-related receptors, they have no estrogen properties at all. So they're not an estrogen receptor. They're structurally similar, and that's how they got that name. Now, the ERRA, so the ERRα alpha, this is the most important one. Arguably, this is the one they're kind of targeting. And it's highly expressed in energy-demanding tissues. So what are the most energy-demanding tissues? That's going to be things like our heart, our skeletal muscle, brown adipose tissue. And those are those things that are going to kind of regulate this whole mitochondrial function, fatty acid oxidation, and endurance metabolism. It's so the ERRAs, easy way I like to make things so it's easy to remember. Just think about A, athlete. So ERRA is athlete's receptor. Now, when we look at ERRB, these are a lot more limited in terms of their expression. And they're mainly involved in development of stem cell and stem cell maintenance. And then the ERR gammas, these are going to be in tissues like the heart and kidney, and they do have roles in energy balance, but they're a lot less potent in the skeletal muscle than like what the ERRA are going to be. So that hopefully kind of breaks it down for everybody.
No, it does. It does because, and we're going to talk more about the estrogen piece of it because sometimes when I first started reading about it, that was I wouldn't say it was the scary part. It's like, wait a minute, the last thing I want to do is activate estrogen in someone who potentially doesn't need that, right? You don't want that. So that could be super important as well. Now, you mentioned like historically, when I was doing some research on it, there was a compound, I think it was like GSK 47 something,
Mm-hmm.
and it only activated the ERR beta and gamma. Mm-hmm. So SLU-PP was a modification on that, so able to kind of activate all three of those. But here's the tricky part, and this is the part that I found fascinating about it, is that the ERR receptor, that estrogen related receptor, is what we call an orphan receptor. It doesn't have a natural ligand. So nothing really, if I'm understanding correctly, it doesn't have like a natural key to that lock. There's nothing that just binds to it, turns it on, turns it off. And so it activates through other mechanisms. So how can something that's like an orphan or just a receptor just kind of in there, kind of in space in the body, just hanging out there, how do we turn that on?
Yeah, that's a great question. When we think about how it's turning these things on, that's going to happen through acetylation, and that's going to be like a post-transitional modification where we've got this acetyl group, and it's going to be added to the protein. And what happens when we add that acetyl group in is it's going to change how tightly the ERRA is going to bind to the DNA and these co-regulators. So, easier way to think about that, um, depending how tight it is, determines whether that light switch is kind of on or off. And then the other way that it can work, by adding a phosphate group to ERRA, so phosphorylation, or associated proteins, that's going to change the shape. So it's kind of like hitting a boost button, and that's going to enhance its activity.
That's a good way to explain it. And the way I had thought about it was like almost like a remote control. And if I want to turn the volume of a you can go up to the TV and turn that button up or down. Great. And that's binding directly to the ligand, where using your remote control or your Bluetooth is the acetylation and phosphorylation process. Like you're sending that radio wave that's actually going to hit that receptor. It's not actually going to the receptor, but it's sending a signal to make that receptor do something. And so that's kind of how I look at this process a little bit, because it doesn't have, it doesn't have a ligand, not a natural ligand, right? And so it's important to know that, because that's different and it's very unique in how it works.
Yeah, I love that. In fact, I'm going to borrow that. I like your explanation better than mine.
It's okay to, analogies are my thing. It's how I survive some of the more complicated concepts we have to deal with.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier about the gamma receptors actually kind of having that effect on mitochondria. But when you look at some of the research and even some of the anecdotal evidence on SLU, SLU, I've been calling it SLU for 3 months. I can't just change overnight. Well, SLU, right? It's described as a mitochondrial agent, as a mitochondrial kind of boosting or affecting compound. So not just in energy, but in kind of like the organ and system repair stuff. So how does it, can you walk me through how that ERR gamma receptor affects mitochondria and some of those mitochondrial benefits?
So mitochondria, and when we think about kind of these far-reaching benefits, they're going to be in our heart tissue, and liver, metabolically active organs, our brain, and even to some degree, like mitochondria, some of the signaling can affect things like circadian regulation. So, in terms of, I guess, sort of, these, what are some of the benefits? What can it do? It's going to increase mitochondrial biogenesis, and the way that happens is it promotes the building of more of these mitochondria. And that comes from the PGC1 alpha, which is kind of like the master architect of mitochondrial creation. And it also improves ATP production efficiency. When we think about if we've got more mitochondria and they're healthy, mitochondria don't just make more ATP, they make it with better fuel flexibility. So we're also putting in the ability to switch back and forth between fat and glucose. And it's going to improve beta oxidation. So it's going to rev up these enzymes that are going to help burn some of that stored fat. And also, it can increase resilience against some of the oxidative stress. And of course, supports mitophagy and some of the turnover. So kind of that whole cleanup phase where we've got those dysfunctional mitochondria and we want to get rid of them. So when we think about that access, we're talking about the PGC1 alpha, AMPK, and ERRA, the sort of the rundown of everything. PGC1 alpha is kind of like this conductor of the mitochondrial symphony. And it's not just going to play these instruments or genes by itself. It needs these transcription factors, which are going to be like the ERRAs. And what those are going to do are those are going to activate and build more of these mitochondria. The AMPK, remember that one's going to be our kind of energy sensor. And when that sensor gets low and it's saying we need energy fast, that's what activates this conductor, this PGC1 alpha. And then the ERRA is sort of the executioner in this pathway. And when it's activated by the PGC1A, it binds then to the DNA, like what we were talking about, the titer binding, acetylation and phosphorylation. These are the two ways it works. And it upregulates these genes for things like mitochondrial enzymes, oxidative phosphorylation, fat metabolism, angiogenesis, and there's some research right now that's even pointing to upregulation of genes like the PER1 and 2, which are some circadian genes.
Okay. No, that's a and I'm glad you brought it up, because when I was doing my homework and trying to learn how this works, I'm kind of like you, man. I want to know how this works, right? It's not just knowing the benefits, but how. I'm very curious like that. And so from what I was reading, this PGC1 alpha, AMPK, ERRA axis is really how it works. But it's an interesting thing because, again, it's almost like a crosstalk. Because if you're listening to this, you're thinking like, wait, if I activate PGC1 alpha or I activate AMPK, because there are a lot of compounds that activate AMPK, am I also going to, you turn on it, and AMPK turns on, PGC1 alpha does its thing. Is that automatically going to activate the ERRα alpha receptors? So like, even if you did something like intermittent fasting, are you still going to turn on the ERRα alpha receptor? And I can't really say yes to that. There's no studies that show it directly. But I did see that it's like there's cross stimulation, there's crosstalk. So if you activate one part of the axis, you can actually activate other sides of it, but not. So here's better. And I know I'm almost kind of talking myself in a circle here. So let me walk it backwards. If I take SLU and I activate ERRα alpha, am I going to activate AMPK and PGC1 alpha? But on the flip side, if you activate AMPK and PGC1 alpha, will you activate ERRα alpha? That's probably the better way to ask that question.
That's a great question. Honestly, I don't have an answer, but when I kind of think about like mechanistically or whatever, so if I'm thinking about something like SLU, what we have is going to be that direct ERRA activation, and then the AMPK is a little bit more indirect. And then when we think about, just to use like fasting for an example, fasting, because there's that energy deficit, if I understand correctly, is going to activate the AMPK, and then that's going to activate the PGC1 alpha, and then that's going to activate the ERRA. So I kind of imagine like we've got this triangle. And so I guess to answer the question as best as I can, it seems like with this access that, it doesn't matter which one of these components we're activating, that there's going to kind of be some feedback between them. So I guess theoretically, we could potentially be activating the ERRA through some of these other mechanisms. Is that does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. It does. Again, sometimes, and the research isn't there yet, but I can kind of see that, right? Because again, if you think about it, if you simulate one part, you'll get that cross stimulation, that crosstalk, and maybe it could be a minor activation, but if it turns it on, you get some of the benefits from it, right? But in general, if you work out and you do things that are going to kind of activate the pathway, the benefits are there, but it's just like, is it an ERRα alpha thing? And we don't know. Or SLU a way of just kind of like, hey, let me kind of skip through point A, point B, get you straight to point C, get the benefits, and then indirectly turn on these other parts. And that's what makes it more of an exercise mimetic, not that you're taking the ERRα alpha, that it's also cross-talking and turning on the AMPK and the PGC1 alpha. Yeah. So I kind of see that. This is the fun part about it. It's like, no one knows, Anthony.
Yeah.
No one knows, This is a good segue, because when we think about exercise mimetics and we think about things that can turn on that AMPK pathways, there's certain things that we kind of know in the optimization, if you want to call it biohacking space, whatever space you want to kind of reside in, fasting, intermittent fasting, caloric deficit, cold plunging, cold exposure, these turn on those same pathways. So how do you use that synergy with SLU-PP in real world with your clients?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of synergy there. And I guess one of the things that we want to think about, and I know everybody's got kind of different ideas on these. To me, it's really important. I guess when I think about extremes, you have the bodybuilding crowd that nothing but mTOR, and you have the ultra longevity people, nothing but AMPK. And where I think the real gold is when we kind of balance those out. And where that ties in with this question is we want to think about how can we leverage some of these tools and how can we progress them, but we don't want to be too AMPK, because if we think about AMPK as being the brake in the car, mTOR as being the gas, if we just have our foot resting on the brake, we're not going to go anywhere. So an example of like what I generally do to kind of leverage a couple of these tools without overdoing it is on the SLU. I like to do the first dose empty stomach in the morning. And to me, the reasoning behind that, we're leveraging that overnight fast. So we've got that AMPK and we're using that SLU to amplify that signal. So theoretically, if I'm thinking this through correctly, the normal AMPK signaling that we get just from having that fast essentially is going to be more profound. So we can really kind of, take advantage of that, clear out, take advantage of that by clearing out some of those cells with autophagy and improving beta oxidation, those sorts of things. Then when I think about like, where would I use like cold or something? The cold, I guess there's kind of a couple ways that I would layer that in. You could do that just a short cold exposure, like maybe just 2 times a week. I don't think that would be overkill. And temperature-wise, anywhere from, if you're really cold adapted, like 40 degrees up to 60 degrees. And you could even do like a brisk walk or something on the other days. And that would kind of be what I think would be sort of like a almost like a priming phase to get somebody going on this. And when you're doing that, like my approach would be like the lowest possible dose of SLU, and we're leaning on these other things a little bit more to kind of, get that big access going, the AMPK, the PGC1 alpha, the ERRA. Now, after a couple weeks and we're kind of acclimated to this, mitochondria is going to have an upregulated stress response and upregulated stress response genes. Then I think that's where I start to use like 16-8 fasts a couple times a week, usually on like a non-training day or complete rest day, and might even bump the cold exposure up to like 3 times a week. And if you wanted to, like if you're not doing weight training, maybe put in some HIIT. And my philosophy on if you're going to do that HIIT, that's, we're not really getting a strength training adaptation. So that would be, I would actually use the cold after the HIIT to reduce inflammation. And then, you have your weight training days where you're getting that signal that you need to build muscle, and you don't want to have the cold right after that. And then sort of the phase 3 would look like kind of tapering that SLU down. We might think about switching to different mitochondrial compounds. We might do like a little bit longer fast here. So maybe if it's something like a 12-hour fasting. Now this would be in somebody that's not an athlete or trying to put on muscle. And with the cold, I've dropped that down to 1 time a week to improve vagal tone, kind of make that adaptation happen. And kind of another trick I have up my sleeve, this would be where, like, if we're talking about how do we layer in specific GHRH, GHRPs, those kind of things, this is where I would use like a tesamorelin because its effects on the electron transport chain and its effects on driving that fat loss, plus a GHRP6, which to my knowledge is the only GHRP that has receptors on the afferent and efferent neurons from the vagus nerve and can improve vagal tone directly.
Okay. That's awesome, dude. It's awesome. And it's just a way of using it to get people to their goals and not doing the same thing over and over consistently and just, changing the protocols. We're definitely going to get into protocols best we can a little bit later and how you use them. But let's kind of, and again, I love the science and I know a lot of our listeners do love the science, but let's kind of transfer that into the real world. So again, the first time I heard of SLU or SLOOP was last year on the Olympics, and like, hey, it's the grapevine, right? They're like, man, it's like I heard a lot of the Olympic athletes are using SLU because it's performance enhancing, but it's not banned by WADA or USDA. And then it's like, does anyone have any proof of that? No, of course we don't, because no one's going to admit to it. There's a whole back and forth. And then but again, from what you've seen with your athletes, with your clients, what benefits are you seeing with the guys and girls you have using this compound?
Yeah, absolutely. It's with all the pro athletes that I consult for, and of course we can't put any names out there, but definitely go-to compound. And the reason it's become a go-to compound for me is because it's really, really good at building that efficient muscle, the kind that's going to burn fat, the kind that's going to be able to switch between glucose and fat for energy. And what we see a lot of times, especially when I've got people that are coming to me from like a bodybuilding background or really more a glycolytic metabolic state, SLU is something that's going to really shift them over to using a lot more fat metabolism. You can see some improvements in VO2 max. Now, in terms of like the ways that I measure, generally like what I'll do, and we can unpack this a little bit more later because I have some kind of specific things I do to kind of figure out dosing and titrating. But some things you'll notice right away outside of the feedback that they give you that, man, I'm performing better, I'm recovering better, I have more energy throughout my workout. You're going to see improvements in blood sugar, fasting blood sugar. Sometimes you'll see improvement in VO2 max, but I feel like that takes a lot longer to manifest. And you even have some people talking about less neurological or brain fatigue, which still trying to figure that one out because I think only 5% of it can cross the blood-brain barrier. But if you're improving mitochondrial function throughout the body, it goes to figure that that's going to kind of be a downstream effect.
Okay. That's really cool, man. So seeing performance, you're seeing kind of like with the VO2 max, it's great. I need to do more testing of that. You're seeing the body composition with the fat metabolism as well. And, and you're seeing a little bit of brain cognition benefits too, which is really cool. Hey, everyone, quick break to let you know this episode is sponsored by Tides Wellness, a company I co-founded and I also serve as medical director for. So as a naturopathic doctor, I spent years prescribing peptides in my clinic, and I helped formulate every product in the Tides line to make it high quality, effective, and more accessible. No needles, just science-backed ingredients that work. I personally take our products every day. I start my mornings with our Rebuild drink powder, and I usually take a second serving after the gym to help with muscle recovery and electrolyte replenishment. Now, when I want to unwind, I reach for our de-stress gummies. They help me relax while staying clear and focused any time of the day. And last but not least, to keep gut inflammation in check, our Revive gummies are my go-to. I use them consistently, and I recommend them to my patients all the time. So if you're curious to try them, you can get a 15% discount off your first order at yourtides.com with the code Dr. Jones. That's DRJONES. Again, you can get a 15% discount off your first order at yourtides.com with the code Dr. Jones, DRJONES. So Tides is about making cutting edge wellness simple, effective, and part of your everyday routine with the power of peptides. Now, when it comes to you mentioned some of the athletes who come from the bodybuilding background, are you seeing muscle growth with SLU or improvements in that skeletal muscle mass, or like you're doing in-body or any type of scanning with that?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. We do the in-body, and one particular strongman athlete that I work with, he lost an amazing amount of weight, and we're talking like 50 pounds. And what's crazy is with 50 pounds in weight loss, I don't think he even lost a full 10 pounds of muscle. And he, even with like there being some muscle loss, what was crazier is that his strength continued to improve, that he didn't have any drop off in performance and felt a lot better. And that kind of goes back to something that was covered at length in the exercise mastermind for SSRP, where they talked about people accumulating this inefficient muscle and becoming insulin resistant and needing to kind of clear house, get that out of there and replace that with this efficient, metabolically flexible muscle.
Hmm. No, that's really cool to see that. One thing I found fascinating here, and I said we're done with the science, but I kind of want to bring it in here where you mentioned some of the body composition. And there was a study I saw that mentioned that it can enhance beta oxidation and lipolysis, but in a parasympathetic state. For those who are like, what that means, that's your rest and digest, right?
Yeah.
Normally, you'll have lipolysis, which is your body's breaking down fat, or that beta oxidation, which is kind of a process in which we kind of use our stored fat. Usually you see that when you're in a sympathetic activity. So this is when you're working out or certain supplements or stimulants that kind of turn that on. So that's incredible that it's going to help you do that in that parasympathetic state. And so this is kind of that thing about like, well, is it more of like, hey, how do I ask this question here, man? Because again, it's like, because I agree with you, the whole thing about like, hey, it's an exercise mimetic, but I also don't want to tell you not to work out.
Yeah.
But does that, knowing, I know where I'm going with this now. So knowing that it kind of turns that lipolysis on in a resting kind of parasympathetic state, does that affect your timing on when you want people to dose it?
Yeah, I think the two optimal times, in my opinion, for taking it are going to be first thing in the morning, as we covered earlier, to leverage at AMPK. And then when we think about like right after a workout, we want to begin that recovery process. We want to be able to switch back to a parasympathetic state. So that's why post workout, in my mind, makes a lot of sense, because here we're able to, one of the things that happens when we train with weights is we have that increased metabolism for post exercise couple hours. And this essentially is going to amplify that without increasing the heart rate or cutting it, tilting the scale more in favor of sympathetic dominance. So you've got a way that you can continue to have that accelerated fat loss, support recovery, and not throw off sympathetic dominance, especially like post workout. They call it rest and digest parasympathetic. And think about when we're going to be taking our biggest meal and the most nutrients, and when we can really get the most out of that whole, shovel the food into repair. And in order to not cause digestive distress, if we have something that can maintain that accelerated metabolism and fat burning, but not switch us out of that parasympathetic state, I think becomes a real cool tool for that reason.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, man. So some of the other studies and research I looked into looked at how SLU-PP can actually affect organ systems, specifically the liver and kidney. Have you seen any changes like in lab work with your patients with like their ALT or AST or their GFR when they're on this compound?
Yeah. So actually, use myself for an example. A couple years ago, I had an acute bout of anemia. It was a whole mess of things. I found a way to give myself mercury poisoning. Everybody tells you eat fresh seafood, and apparently there is a limit on that.
Mm-hmm.
But long story short, had a number of kind of health stuff pop up, and my EGFR went all the way down to 39. And within 2 months, I had it back up to 59. Now, SLU was part of that. It wasn't the only thing I was doing, but definitely, I think, played a role. In terms of the athletes I've worked with and general population, when we look at things like A1C, I've seen as much as a whole point drop in 10 weeks. And when we look at things like AST, ALT, across the board seems to really have a positive impact on that. Now, initially, it's kind of funny. Like if somebody were to start taking it and then go test their liver enzymes, like the next week, because I have some people that are kind of OCD about their blood work. It was weird. We almost saw like this little, not like a bad bump, but just a little bit of a bump. And it's like, what's going on here? But I guess if I'm thinking it through, and you might have a better take on this than me, but if I'm thinking it through, like if I exercise and I go do my blood work the next day, it can elevate those AST, ALT values. And because it's an exercise mimetic, especially if we're kind of amplifying a system that's not used to that, in my mind, it makes sense that we just kind of have that real transient, in some people, bump in those values, but then give it a month and they're back down and even healthier than they were before.
Yeah, I can see that. And then obviously if they're working out a lot, that can affect it. And then, I always look at the hidden factors too, because I'll ask someone like, hey, like when's the last time you had Tylenol? Like, oh, or people, some reason still use Tylenol when they need to, right? And then it's like, oh yeah, I don't really, but I did go out this past weekend and have a few drinks and all that. I want to look at all the different factors. As long as it's not like crazy elevated, if it's like, okay, if you're in the hundreds, 200s, okay, we're going to work that up. But let's say, ultimately we like to see our guys in the, the 30s, a range for ALT, AST, and our females are in the 20s, somewhere in that range. Obviously, everyone's an individual and different. But if it goes up slightly, okay, we'll keep an eye on it, look at the different factors, maybe do some liver support if we need to temporarily, and then come back. And the liver is an amazing organ outside of hepatitis or fatty liver. It sort of self-corrects most of the time. So because even we have some athletes and bodybuilders and they'll, somehow they've got a hold of some oxandrolone. I don't know how, somehow they have, right?
Yeah.
And their liver enzymes be low. And I used to be like, liver enzymes, I need to put you on all these different things. Now I'm like, yeah, you do your 8-week cycle, take some milk thistle, call me when you're done. You learn not to stress it too much, right? And again, this is not me endorsing it. This is just saying, everybody calm down. It's really hard to throw the liver off, though we want to protect it, but it's also really hard to do damage to that liver. So in, cellular medicine, personalized medicine, functional medicine, depending on the flavor you like to be in here, one of the most intriguing processes for me, and one of the things I love the most about it, is finding the optimal dose and the optimal protocol for a person versus this static dosing protocol. Thou shalt have this at this dose, this time. We're able to kind of play with our dosing and our protocols to optimize the person. That being said, do you have a specific process for titrating and personalizing SLU-PP with your clients and athletes?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love this question because I really want people to kind of understand the thinking behind it. And it's not one of those more is better things. It's better is better. So when we think about like, what's it doing and what are some things that are easy to measure that we can validate that it's working and we've kind of reached a dose where we're good. The two simplest things I like to check are going to be blood glucose. And if we think about, well, why are we checking blood glucose? Well, if we're doing something that's going to be improving insulin sensitivity, it would go to figure that our fasting blood glucose should be improving. So usually I'll kind of get a baseline of where somebody's at before they start. And then I'm going to check after we start dosing. And what I look for is anywhere from down like 5 points. And that's just going to kind of indicate that they're having that smooth transition to being able to use fat and improving insulin sensitivity. If you have something like a PNOE or some way to measure like RER, what I like to look for is kind of seeing that RER starting to head towards that 0.7 where we're seeing a lot of fat oxidation. And normally when we've got somebody that's more reliant on glucose, RER is going to be a little bit closer to a 1. So if we're creating that metabolic flexibility, one of the things that we would expect to see is, getting down towards that 0.7. And also, if we're able to kind of look at when that transition happens, how long are they burning fat before they switch over to using glucose? We want to see that kind of extend out a little bit. So, in terms of a trend, if the RER was staying like greater than 9, even when you added in SLU, that tells us that we have pretty poor metabolic flexibility. So we'd want to kind of, we're probably going to need to raise that up. And then another device, like if people don't have the Pinoe, super inexpensive and surprisingly accurate, is those Lumen devices. And that's just looks like a little kind of like circle thing. And you breathe into it. And if you're at like level 1 or 2, mostly fat burning, level 3 to 4 is going to be mixed, and level 5 is going to be mostly carb burning. And what we find when somebody has one of those and we can measure them with SLU, they really seem to hang around that 3 to 4 pretty well. And that's reinforcing that we've built some metabolic flexibility. And if they're outside of that, we might try increasing that dose a little bit to kind of get them closer to where we feel it would be ideal.
Okay. Gotcha. So from what, and we're going to talk about your company once we get towards the end here, and some of the other compound pharmacies that are starting to kind of, dip their toes in the SLU water, is that I've seen that starting dose or at the 100 microgram capsule here.
Oh.
And so what we've been doing is we'll start you at 100 micrograms and give it a couple weeks and just see how, because I'm all about how you feel. We may check in 3 or 4 weeks, how you doing. And if you're like, kind of meh with it, maybe we go twice a day. But if you're, some people are like, oh my God, I feel amazing at this 100, I'm probably going to keep you there. You feel great, And so for me, it's like, I like the minimum but maximum effective dose. I kind of throw that but maximum in there too, right? It's not just, minimum dose, maximum benefits, better way to say it. And so, but I think some of the athletes, they tend to need a little bit more. And so when I was looking at some of, again, not a ton of research on it, I've seen some dosing up to like a full milligram. Yeah. And I was like, that seems a little aggressive, a little aggressive with it. Is there a sweet spot that you kind of find, and does it differ between men and women on that sweet spot with dosing here? I know everyone's different. There's going to be variation here, but what do you see?
The sweet spot that I've found seems to be women seem to do really well with like that 100 micrograms to 200 micrograms up to 2 times a day. And for men, I've not had somebody go over 400 micrograms. I've personally tried over 400 micrograms, and I can tell you I didn't feel any better or see any benefit. I just kind of wanted to have a sense of something to relate to people. So when I'm thinking about this compound and, how do we come up with these doses? We're checking the blood glucose, the things like we talked about. And then if we're not seeing the needle move, what I always look at before I would want to increase the dose is, are we doing things to support this compound? So the things that we're going to need to have in there for this to really work and for people to really see the benefit from it are going to be things like, I'm really big on making sure you got your CoQ10 in there or a debenone. I really like to use carnitine. One of the cool things about SLU is it upregulates that, oh boy, I always butcher this name. It's the carnitine transport enzyme, and between that and the antioxidant and krill oil, those are just 2 words I can't say. But kind of getting back to the whole support thing, we want to make sure that we've got some sort of NAD support in there. For the mitochondria, I like a 5-amino-1-MQ. I want to make sure I'm supporting with carnitine, CoQ10, and N-acetylcysteine so that we're not accumulating too much oxidative stress. And then, and we can unpack some more stuff when we get to protocols. Love doing something like SS31, so we're stabilizing that cardiolipin and having the benefits of a mitochondrial antioxidant that won't interfere with exercise signaling.
So I always feel like there should be the asterisk or the, hey, not so much a warning label when it comes to mitochondrial compounds and mitochondrial peptides, right? Because the thing is that it's that delicate balance, right? Because mitochondria are interesting because they when they function or when they function too much, they're going to put out more reactive oxidative species, right?
Mhm.
But on the flip side, like we do want some oxidative stress because if you work out and totally suppress oxidative stress, then you're not going to, you're not getting any gains. You're not getting
Yeah.
any improvement because you need to stress the system, right? So how do you find that balance between your between, your redox balance? Like, because it's hard to test for that. So what are you looking for if you think someone is like their mitochondria is a little bit too revved up, or if they're suppressing that oxidative stress a little bit too much? They're taking all the things, glutathione and NAC and alpha lipoic acid, and give me this, because I know that free radicals are bad for you, but and it's like you're overdosing it. If someone's like putting out a fire, there's probably such thing as too much water where you're causing more damage after the
Yeah.
fire is out.
Yeah, no, that's a great question and something I really like to make sure people are aware of because that's how you get the benefit from these things and stay safe. So, some subjective things that you can kind of look for is if you're taking these mitochondrial compounds and you feel like flat energy, despite the fact that you're doing things that are in theory improving mitochondrial function, that's going to be a big red flag. Or brain fog, or like you have that kind of tired but wired, jittery fatigue, um, red flag. And for fellow meatheads out there, if you're going to the gym and you're not really getting this pump while you're training, um, that's also going to come down to cellular metabolism and could be a red flag. And then, um, sleep disruption, although there's so many things that can disrupt sleep that's kind of a hard one. If I'm looking at more objective biomarkers, some things I kind of keep an eye on are that HRV, and HRV is kind of a tricky one to read. When I look at HRV, I'm really focused on the trends. Some people are just going to have a low HRV, and for example, this is an extreme example, but like let's say somebody's got a 10. Like 14, I mean, that's a 40% increase. So that's fantastic. But conversely, if they have that 10 and they drop down to 8, that's a 20% decrease. Whereas if somebody had 100 and they drop down to, 80, it's a little bit more apparent. So tracking the trends, I think, is helpful. If you have access to like resting lactate testing, um, you don't want to see a resting lactate of over like 1.8 millimoles. That's going to be indicative of poor mitochondrial clearance. And when you're looking at things like uric acid, if it's greater than 6, that could be a redox imbalance too. So there's probably a lot of other ones you could test for, but I think those or like HSCRP over 1. Those are kind of easy ones for everybody to test for.
Got him. Awesome. So I want to circle back to this whole estrogen related receptor thing and that initial fear that I have, because this is kind of like hammering it in, because when we look at risk, and obviously you also want to look at contraindications, risks, side effects, the whole shebang, anything that we're doing. But with SLU being an ERR, is there a risk of any side effects like gynecomastia or water retention or, tachycardia or even palpitations if that estrogen gets too high? Can it potentially cause any of that?
It's a really interesting question because SLU isn't going to bind to that estrogen receptor, so it wouldn't be direct. But if we think in terms of mechanisms and how this could potentially have some effect, if the ERRA is causing sort of a hormonal shift from like a redox overload, which would affect aromatase expression or liver clearance, then there could be some risk, I think, theoretically. I don't think water retention would really come into play unless I think that would be something that might be a byproduct of if people are feeling really good on this, exercising a lot harder, and they're just forgetting to hydrate properly. So to answer the question, I would say there's not a direct concern. But that being said, we always, no matter what compound it is, we want to think about the importance of having that balanced redox state and hydrating and just all those basic things that we always stay on top of.
Yeah, and I'm not so much worried about it, but I do think if I have a patient who is estrogen dominant for our female patients, or you just got a super aromatizer and a guy where it's like, dude, like you just see testosterone and make estradiol just from looking at your injection, then I may say maybe not with that,
Yeah.
or start low and slow and then test. And then, okay, let me titrate up. Okay, let's test, right? And so you keep an eye on it, because you don't. And again, even when it comes to something like gynecomastia, man, it's like it's not gonna be like, oh, my estrogen was high for a week and now I'm wearing a C cup. That's really not how that works. It takes a little time. We're talking about like, hey man, I started taking SLU and I never stopped, and I haven't seen you for 2 years, and you know, people are asking questions.
Yeah.
they're asking questions, you know, and you want to be kind of aware of that. But no, man, you know, but no, I think this is fascinating, man. So I'm pretty excited about it as another compound to use to improve body composition, improve mitochondrial function, you know, improving energy overall, and even some of these other benefits, because like you said, with cardiac benefits, even the organ health benefits, I think it can be amazing for it. It's just being smart how you use it.
Yeah.
Like you said, more is not more. You know, when it comes, because again, and that's the thing, especially with guys, man, we're used to that, dude. It's like, oh man, 250 milligrams feels good. I bet you 1,000. Oh,
Yeah.
wait till you see me with 1,000, right? You know, and that's just a mindset we try to educate people out of. So here's a question for you here, man. So if for a practitioner who wants to learn more about SLU, I'm going to go back and forth, man. At this point, it's officially interchangeable with me, right? For clinicians who want to learn more about it, even, you know, potential patients or clients out there that want to learn more about this compound and even how to access it, what advice do you have for them?
In terms of like some really good resources for reading about it, there've been just a ton of studies done lately. In fact, they're even looking at things like how it could potentially interact with the angiotensin receptor and maybe provide some protection against like COVID. So just kind of keeping up with the literature is a really good thing. When there's a ton of stuff about it on Instagram and you know, different social media platforms. And as I'm sure you're aware, you know, there's some stuff that's just wrong and some stuff that's pretty good. And what I tell people is when you're looking at like SLU or really any of these compounds, you can't go wrong if you focus on the pathways and the mechanism of action, and really kind of taking the time to go back, think about how is this working? What are some of the bottlenecks that could occur when I'm taking this? You know, the failure point. Is this other compound I'm taking with it? Is it contradicting it? So just kind of those basics, you know, thinking through the pathways and the mechanisms. I think that you're going to be in a great spot. You know, I'm always happy to talk to people about the compounds, and I love it. It's I probably spend too much time talking about them, but they're fascinating to me, and I'm always trying to learn and happy to share any information I can.
Okay, awesome. And we will put, now that you said that, put yourself out there, we're gonna, you know, now we're going to put your contact info in the show notes. It'll be there, and we'll get into that in a little bit here. But as long as you're open with our listeners and even the clinicians who contact you asking questions, please, we'll have all that at the end here and in the show notes here. All right, man, 30-year career. That's a long time, right? You know, and again, like I said, you've earned those grades. You have earned those, my friend. But if you can go back in time, the start of your journey, what is the one piece of advice you would give yourself? Like, hey man, I got something to tell you. Stop what you're doing. Put that weight down. Put it down. Listen to me. What would it be?
That's actually good advice. I think I would tell myself to continue to be curious, but not be reckless. That take time to learn about those pathways, those mechanisms, think things through. be curious, ask questions, and definitely, and this is kind of a personal one because, for as much success as I've had training other people, I've had the injuries pile up from my own stupidity. So whether we're talking about peptides or training, more is not better, better is better. That make sure you're sending a signal and adapting to it, but it doesn't have to be yelled through a bullhorn with an amplifier hooked up. That it's equally important to rest and let that adaptation take place.
I know. I had to learn that for a while, man. So I was more of the 7 days a week kind of person. Like, what do you mean rest day? There's no rest day. There's rest morning, And then I was like, oh, I'm getting hurt. Oh, I got hurt again. Now I'm like, man, I like rest days. I've learned, finally 25 years later, like, okay, we need rest days, right?
Yeah.
And so that's super important. So I think everyone takes that in mind as well, or takes that to heart. Okay, man. So for our listeners, how can they find you, learn more about you, learn about your journey, learn more about the cool things you have going on? Where do we find you?
Thank you so much. I'm pretty active on Instagram. Always reading news, science articles, and I like to make videos about them. So they're kind of fun to watch and easy to digest. It's just at Anthony Castore. In Columbus, Ohio, I'm based in Columbus. I've got a company, Drive Longevity Solutions. And basically what I do is consult for everybody from general population all the way up to pro athletes about how can we optimize your health? How can we put together really smart protocols? And it's fun because, we work on it as a team. The person that hires me and myself, I really like them to be part of the process. I'll be speaking at Peptide World Congress this year. I'm super excited about that. I mean, truly humbled to be up there. People a lot smarter than me up there, and cool to have a chance to be up there and share something. My talk is going to be on the strategic combination of how do you pick a training stimulus? What are the cellular pathways and signals that you're sending? And how can you strategically layer on the peptides, the correct macronutrients and supplements to amplify that signal, get the most out of it, and how do you know when to change? So it'll really kind of be the people that go to that event, hear that talk. My goal is that within an hour, they'll leave with a good working knowledge of how to put together effective programs for themselves and their clients.
Oh, dude, that's awesome, dude. Well, congratulations, man. That's super awesome. I think that's where I met you as a previous event. So it's really cool that full circle, man. Full circle. Now you're going to be on stage. That's really cool. Yeah, definitely, man. All right, man. Well, I want to say thank you one last time for your time and sharing your knowledge, man. I guess anyone listening to this, if they don't know about SLU or SLOOP, if you're talking to me at the end from listening to this conversation, that's a whole other story. Because I think you were very thorough about it, man. Explain everything, talk about the pathways, talk about how we use it. And I can't ask for much more than that, man. That's pretty much why I love these conversations, getting the science, but also how do you apply the science? And that's really cool about it. All right. Thank you, man.
Thank you so much.
All right, everyone. This is Dr. Greg Jones in the Optimization Academy. I want to thank you all for listening, for that information on Anthony, like where to find him and his Instagram, and for the Drive Health, right?
Drive Longevity Solutions.
Drive Longevity Solutions. Speaking of brain function, I will have all that in the show notes as well. I want to thank you all for listening. Until next time, you've been listening to the Dr. Greg Jones Optimization Academy.